about ready to start. Welcome everybody to the Drugs and Policy in Indonesia panel, and thank you so much for coming. Before we get started, I would like to say that we changed the order of presentations just a little bit for coherence. So the first presentation in the program is going to be the last presentation, and the last presentation is going to be the first presentation. So the first presenter is Ajeng Larasati, to talk about drug policy and its human rights impact.
I hope you cannot see me. Okay. Hello everyone. A bit of introduction. My name is Ajeng Larasati. I currently work at LBH Masyarakat. It's Legal Aid Institute in Jakarta, Indonesia. We provide free legal aid services for poor and marginalized groups such as drug users, transgenders, sex workers, and urban poor as well. Apart from the legal service that we provided, we also empower these poor and marginalized groups. We train them to be paralegals so they can provide basic legal advice to their peer community members, because access to legal aid is not that easy in Indonesia. I am studying here in Essex, University of Essex, for my master's degree. So I will be here for 1 year and then go back afterward to Indonesia. I hope to give you a basic idea on how the policy in Indonesia is. This might not be too detailed, so if there's anything that I haven't covered, you can ask me at the end of this session. Okay, so these are the issues that I will cover in my presentation. I will talk about the legal context, policy and legal context, and then I'll also say something about the drug enforcement agency. So, like, who are the actors of Indonesian drug policy, and then I will talk about the drug policy and its human rights cost, how the drug policy impacts human rights realization, and then I'm gonna close with a kind of conclusion, but I'm gonna let you make the conclusion yourself through the data that I will share. Okay, so in essence, Indonesian drug policy is still very, very punitive towards drug users, although the governments, often say things like we already decriminalized drug user. That's not what it is in practice and in law as well. The law I put there, law number 35, is actually the one that provides punitive framework towards drug users. I'm gonna talk each of these later on. So I'm just gonna briefly describe what are the compulsory rehabilitation and harm reduction programs. There were some progress in the past where the National Narcotic Board campaigned for access to rehabilitation for drug users, actually. But unfortunately, instead of encouraging for enabling environment so that drug user wants to access treatment voluntarily, they impose a policy where drug users should report themselves. So it's like a compulsory rehabilitation. They have to report themselves to the authorities. It could be police, it could be hospital. They have to say that I am a drug user, and they will be registered under the treatment. So this forced rehabilitation is already in place for like 7 years, for like 7 to 5 years until now. But it doesn't make a huge progress. At the same time, the Indonesian government also regulates a harm reduction program. So harm reduction program is basically they provide, it's an approach where instead of ask people to stop using drugs, they help you to reduce the harm of drug use. That's harm reduction. But the problem with this harm reduction program is that the regulation that regulates this is actually very, very weak. So in terms of the hierarchy of the laws, this is only just like a ministerial level, while the criminalization policy is on the law level. So obviously the law is this, stronger than the ministerial regulation. So when it comes to the criminalization, the approach to drug policy is very punitive, like I said previously. The criminal provisions will be charged according to the criminal activities without looking at who is the offender. So for example, if a drug user is arrested while they are using drugs, which is highly unlikely because you use drugs in a like closed environment, not in a public space. If they are arrested when they use drugs, then they will be charged with drug using article. If they are arrested while they buy drugs in a transaction, they will be charged with drug purchase, drug dealing articles, which carries minimum 5 years of imprisonment, no matter how small the amount of drug is. So the dealer and the user will have the same articles charged to them. So it's not proportional when it comes to the policy. And if you are in legal context, there is one very important aspect of mens rea. It's the criminal intent. So when you are the criminal intent here is sorry, I'm very nervous. So in the legal context, there's a concept of criminal intent, and in drug cases, there's no criminal intent. So they don't care whether you are intentionally violate the law or not. So for example, if I hate Sylvia, I can put drugs in Sylvia's bag, and if the police find out that Sylvia has a drug in her bag, Sylvia can get arrested for drug possession. Sylvia cannot say things like, well, I don't know, it's not me. You can like use fingerprints or something. No, it doesn't exist in Indonesian law, drug laws. As long as you are caught with drugs in your possession, you will get charged by drug possession article. That's basically what it is, the consequences of the absence of mens rea. And the spirit to criminalize drug use is embodied in the law enforcement agency's authority to carry undercover buy and control delivery. So basically, the police can fabricate the case. These two measures actually lead to lots of case fabrication and police entrapment in practice. So some of our clients, they admitted that they were seduced by a girl. They were like approached by these girls, and then they have like a 2 days, 3 days a week relationship with these girls, and then suddenly these girls ask them to buy drugs for them, usually marijuana, because maybe it's the easiest to get. And then when our client involved in the drug buying the drugs, the police come and arrested them. So it's these girls are planted by the police to initiate the intention to buy drugs. Like if our client doesn't meet these girls, then they will not have the idea to initiate the crime. That's on the other hand, there are efforts to put drug users to treatment, but it is conducted through forced rehabilitation. The law itself says that drug dependent must be rehabilitated, and this forced rehabilitation is actually admitted by the Indonesian delegation to the CND, and without saying that we are forcing drug user to treatment. This compulsory treatment, compulsory reporting it imposes criminal sanction to the family of drug user if they are failed to report their family members who are using drugs. So if I have a son and he is using drugs, then I have to tell the police that, or the hospital, that my son is using drugs, basically. And if I fail to do that, I can be arrested for that. And the idea with the compulsory rehabilitation is that the regulations say that there will be no legal charge for those who are under compulsory rehabilitation programs. So it's like, if I already reported myself, then the police cannot charge me with drug offense. But the truth is, the practice is, I can still be charged. So that's the gap there as well. And the last one is the Indonesian government put in place some regulations on harm reduction programs. So drug user can access opioid substitution therapy or needle syringe program or ARV in some community health centers or hospitals. But the problem with that is the fear of criminalization and forced rehabilitation discourage these people to, want to access this harm reduction program. And unfortunately, the more punitive the law is, the harder it is to, get people who use drugs to want to access treatment. So that's the context of the policy, and here are some government agencies that are related with drug policy. In the legal context, for the law enforcement, we have the National Narcotic Board and the police. In practice, these two bodies are not really in line when dealing with drug policy. There is a structural ego where the National Police and the National Narcotic Board are often found to be competing each other. So if the police, let's say today, announce that they arrest 35 kilograms of drugs, then the next day the BNN will say, well, we arrest 50 kilograms of drugs. So it's like a competition for them, which, the idea is to beat the other one, not to achieve the goal of this narcotic law. And it's unclear. Their works overlap and unclear. It's not like the corruption bodies versus the National Police, where they have set a regulation that if the amount of money is below X, then it is the police jurisdiction to deal with the case, and if it's more than X, then it is the corruption agencies that will deal with the case. It's not the case in drugs law, so it's just like chaos, basically. And when it comes to health-related policy, there is also like a small kind of ego between the BN and the National Narcotic Board and the Ministry of Health, because basically Ministry of Health should be the one to deal with the drug rehabilitation programs, for example. But the narcotic law says that the BNN has the right has the authority to shape the policy on related with the drug rehabilitation. These are some other problems with the current drug policy. The current drug policy imposes national targets that leads to case fabrication. So each local police office in Indonesia, so, for example, to give you an idea, in Jakarta there are like more than 30 local police offices, and each of them has a target to be achieved. So for example, in one police office, they must arrest 5 drugs cases in a month, for example. And can you imagine how many the case, like how much the case will be like for all of the Jakarta area. And to help them achieving the targets, they use the controlled delivery and undercover buy because they admit that drug case is something that they have to initiate, like they admit that. And apart from the target and case fabrication, the drug policy also have a social economic cost of imprisonment. So there's one great organization called PKNI. It's like the Indonesian Producer Network, and they launched this. They published this research on the social and economic cost of imprisonment for drug users. And in their report, they found that it leads to the loss of jobs when it comes to workers who use drugs, and the loss of education when it comes to students who use drugs. So the schools usually will just like make these students drop out when they found out that they are using drugs, basically. And there's also a problem with the economic cost of being in prison, and it's not cheap. So, for example, if your family is arrested by the police and being put in a detention, to visit them, you have to bring foods, you have to bring cigarettes, you have to bring meals for them, for your family member, and for the police officers there. And sometimes you even have to pay the police officers in order to be able to meet your family who are arrested. And if you visit them every day, can you imagine how much money you have to spend? And in Indonesian legal system, you can be, the pre-trial detention can be like up to 1 year, up to 300 days before they get sentenced, for example. So it's really, really like a prolonged detention. 5 minutes. It's a really, really long period of time, and you have to spend lots of money on that. And I'm gonna talk about the human rights costs. The first one is the right to health. The treatments are available, but unfortunately it is inaccessible. So the problem with the criminalization put the drug users away from treatment because they don't want to, expose themselves to government. And then there's also a problem with the treatment fee. Not all of the drug users can pay the fee, and it is not under the national health system at the moment. And then there's also a problem with the quality of the service, where we found there are some allegations of torture and ill treatment in rehabilitation centers. And for drug offenders, the law says that you can get rehabilitation instead of imprisonment. But the problem is that it is available at the end of the legal process, and it is the judge who knows nothing about dependency who decides whether you should be treated or you should be in prison, and how long you should be treated if you are put in a rehabilitation center. This is the rehabilitation sentence. Like I said, because the law doesn't consider whether you are a user or a dealer when they arrest you, it often leads to drug user being charged with non-drug using articles, which means that basically this drug user has no access to rehabilitation as part of the sentence. And there are difficulties in gathering evidence as well to show that I am a drug user. They need the doctors to come to the trial to speak on behalf of them. But the problem is that the doctors themselves are sometimes afraid to go to the court. Like the stigma of like legally something complicated, you just want to stay away from it. And judges are lacking knowledge about drug dependency, but they are the ones who decide the rehabilitation, how long someone should serve in the rehab. So in our latest research, we found out that out of 522 cases, only 8% or around 40 cases are sentenced to rehab. And another human rights violation is access to legal aid. Our research shows that only 45% assisted by lawyers, and out of these, many of those who doesn't get lawyer assistance are those who are punishable by death penalty. According to our regulation, if you are punishable by death penalty, you should be assisted by a lawyer, but in drug cases, they just ignore that. And also the torture and ill treatment. So the police always told us that we don't need to get conviction from these drug users when they are arrested. So we don't have to torture them. One, they admitted they torture, right? And then the reason for the torture is not to get affirmation, that they are using drugs or not, but to get money. So drug user is often used as a cash machine for the police. The more you torture someone and they give you money, the more often you will be tortured. Because the police idea is that you will get money when you torture someone. You torture me, I'll give you money to stop torture, but what's gonna happen? They're just gonna keep torturing me so they get money again and again and again. And on the right to life, we know that Indonesia still imposes right to death penalty. And out of 170 persons on death row, 93 of them are for drug offenses. So, death penalty itself is a violation of a right to life. This is something about the right to life and extraordinary crimes and more serious crimes. I'm just going to skip this. So the conclusion, the objective of the drug policy is to prevent, protect, and save the life of Indonesian people from drug use. But the data shows that in 2008 there are 3 million people who use drugs, and then we imposed this new law. Law number 35 year 2009. And what happened 6 years later is that the number of people who use drugs is increasing. So it is you who decides that, according to these numbers, it is, you can see whether this policy works or not, basically. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Ajeng. And just as a clarification, since we have so much time for these presentations, each presentation will take about 20 minutes. The next presenter, and about the questions, if it's okay with everybody here, we'll just save up all the questions to the very end of the panel. Our next presenter is Claudia, who is going to talk, let me pick up my cheat sheet, HIV risk among women who inject drugs in Indonesia.
Hi everyone. My name is Claudia. I'm a doctoral candidate here at Oxford University in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. And I also work with an organization called Harm Reduction International based in London that engages in advocacy and research with international drug policy bodies and civil society. So today I'll be sharing some preliminary results from a study that we conducted over the past year in Indonesia, 2 years really, in Indonesia, focusing particularly on unsafe injecting practices and consensual practices among women who inject drugs. And in this particular presentation, I will be looking at injecting practices just because of limited time. So before I start, I just want to mention and thank our partners in Indonesia. particularly the Indonesian Drug Users Network, as well as our funders, without whom this research would not have been possible, and of course the women, the over 700 women who participated in this research. So by way of background, women who use drugs make up about 1/3 of all drug users worldwide, and this includes about 3.8 million women who inject drugs. And there's substantial evidence that women have very different experiences of drug use and addiction, and very different needs than men who use drugs. They often also are at much higher risk of diseases like HIV and hepatitis C compared with men. Indonesia is one of 3 countries in Asia, alongside Pakistan and the Philippines, where HIV and hepatitis C rates continue to rise rather than stabilize. The HIV epidemic there is concentrated among high-risk populations, such as sex workers and injected drug users, men who have sex with men. And among drug users in particular, prevalence rates, as of 2013, reached almost 40%. And that's a national level. Within particular cities, these rates were sometimes higher. So in Jakarta, for instance, they're higher than in other parts of the country. People who inject drugs in particular are also disproportionately affected by hepatitis C, with prevalence rates in Indonesia ranging from 49% to 80%. And just to mention a quick, also preliminary result from a study we just completed there, which is not out yet. In Jakarta, we had rates of more than 90% of hepatitis C among a sample of about 320 drug users there, with co-infection rates of HIV at about 50%, so very, very high rates. So women. Now, most of the evidence available in Southeast Asia more generally, and in Indonesia in particular, focuses on men who inject drugs. So a lot of the prevalence rates that I've just quoted, unfortunately, tend to be based on men. The sample sizes of women who use drugs in these prevalence studies are very small. In the last prevalence study that was disaggregated, where data was disaggregated and was reported, there were only 50 women and something like 1,100 men. So the numbers of women included in national prevalence studies in Indonesia is just too small to allow us to determine what prevalence there actually is among them. Women are estimated to comprise about 11% of the total injecting population in Indonesia, which is estimated at about 74,000 injecting drug users. But we do have qualitative research that suggests they experience higher HIV risk and they engage in riskier practices. But at this point, it's remained a very small scale. So, the question I'm going to be addressing in this presentation is, which factors increase vulnerability to HIV, hepatitis C, and other bloodborne viruses via unsafe injecting practices among women who inject drugs in Indonesia? This is our study. Perempuan Bersuara study, or Women Speak Out, was a cross-sectional study among 731 adult women who inject drugs. We recruited women from 3 provinces in Indonesia with the highest rates of HIV and injecting drug use. So this was Jabodetabek, the kind of greater Jakarta area with its suburbs, Bandung, West Java, and Tangerang, Banten, where Tangerang was included partly because there's been a spike in HIV cases there in the last prevalence study compared with other areas in Indonesia. The research was carried out between September 2014 and June 2015, and recruitment was conducted using respondent-driven sampling, which is a type of chain referral procedure that includes women referring a set number of their peers to the study, and then those peers being asked to refer their own peers to the study. And data was collected by trained peer field workers who used tablets. They used an Android-based mobile device to collect data. So for this particular presentation, I'm using two measures of unsafe injecting practices that lead to the transmission of HIV and hepatitis C. The first is receptive syringe sharing, and this is a composite measure of the measures of the different factors you see on there. So it includes injecting with somebody else's used syringe after they inject with it, and so on. And sharing injecting paraphernalia, and this is referring to non-needle paraphernalia. So this includes water used to mix drugs, filters, and other injecting equipment, which has been shown to lead to hepatitis C transmission in particular. To conceptualize the context for injection-related risk, I used a risk environment theoretical framework, which was first proposed by Professor Tim Rhodes at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. The risk environment conceptualizes drug harms as products of social situations and environments in which those individuals participate. And in that sense, the responsibility for drug-related harms and the focus of interventions aimed at reducing those harms are not just the responsibility of individuals, but also of social and political institutions that have a role in the production of those harms. I won't go through these in detail because I'll explain them in the results section, but these are the factors that I tested in the models, and they were mapped based on the theoretical framework I described earlier. And we looked at which of these predicted or which of these were independently associated with the injection risk outcomes that I presented earlier, so with receptive syringe sharing and sharing of injecting paraphernalia. These are the data collection sites, which I described earlier. So sorry. Oh, okay, I'm not gonna go back, because I'm scared of this computer. As part of the study, I've considered the sites as 3 separate sites, so I've considered the 3 kind of mini sites within Jabodetabek as one large Jabodetabek site. This is just a little bit of visual kind of representation. So this is one of the sites where we collected data. This is Banchos. This is just behind this wall here. There's a big garbage dump where people inject drugs. There's sex work. There's anything you want there. And it's also obviously a very high-risk area, and of course it operates with a tacit agreement with the police. And this is another area. This is Gambrek, central Jakarta, and I've tried to lighten the picture a little bit so you can see this is actually a public injecting area. Back here are people who are crouching. There are children. There are, it goes quite far out into the back there, and you can kind of come in and get a needle. You can also pick up a used needle from this garbage heap here, which many people do, and injecting happens. And I think at this moment, Gambrek is not active anymore because there's been a police raid, as far as I can tell. But there are many other places like this that pop up around cities all over Indonesia all the time. I'll get to the results soon. So for this analysis, I used a 2-step analysis strategy. First, adjusted associations between potential correlates with and the 2 unsafe injecting outcomes were calculated, controlling for socio-demographic factors and for study sites. So I controlled for women being married, for them having dependent children or not, for employment status and education status. And finally, I conducted 2 multivariate logistic regression models, which were conducted to test independent associations between all the factors together in one model to see which ones, when you control for everything else, remained significant or explained the variance within the 2 outcomes. So here we are. We found that HIV prevalence among this particular sample was 46.6%. This was based on self-report. We didn't test them. And there was also a percentage that didn't know their status. This was among women who knew their status, which was about 90% of the sample. The majority of women had a high school education. More than 1/3 were married. About half were unemployed. and more than half had dependent children or other dependents that they were responsible for in the household. We found quite high rates of intimate partner violence among these women, so more than 2/3 reported experiencing physical abuse, psychological aggression, or sexual coercion in the past 12 months. More than 70% reported this during their lifetime. More than 1 in 5 of these women went to prison. And about 16% of them reported actually injecting in public places like the street, parks, public toilets, and parking lots. And I just want to focus for a second on this factor because public injecting has been associated with increased HIV risk. It's been associated with police violence as well. And clearly in the Indonesian context, it has the potential to place drug users in a really risky situation where they might rush an injection and share equipment or use whatever needle they could find so they could get the heroin in there as fast as possible because they're scared someone might see them or a police officer might walk by. A little bit more. So 1 in 5 women reported engaging in illegal activities such as selling drugs and stealing as their main source of income. About 1 in 3 were also sex workers. And of course, this places them at even higher risk of infection due to the precarious nature of transactional sex and also due to the decreased power of negotiation in sexual transactions that involve drug use. This has been seen in other samples of sex workers and women who use drugs. And about half of them also had a sex partner who injected drugs, which again is a proven risk factor for HIV. And finally, the policy and legal risk environment factors. About 4 in 10 women reported experiencing police extortion, so that the solicitation of services or bribes in order to avoid arrest. And about 1 in 3 reported experiencing verbal, physical, or sexual abuse from police officers. So quite high numbers. And in terms of protective factors, I looked at voluntary HIV testing and counseling, having entered drug treatment, accessing opioid substitution therapy, and accessing opioid substitution therapy. So after controlling for socio-demographic factors and study recruitment site, women who were ever incarcerated, so women who had been to prison, were about 1.5 times more likely to engage in receptive syringe sharing. Women who experienced intimate partner violence were more than twice as likely to report receptive syringe sharing than women who did not. So in this case, intimate partner violence was independently associated with engaging in this behavior. Public injecting, women who engaged in injecting in public places were more than 3 times as likely to engage in this behavior than women who injected in more private spaces, like a home, for example, or the dealer's house, which is also a common injecting space. And women who engaged in sex work were also significantly more likely women who engaged in sex work, women whose main source of income was from illegal activities, were both more likely to report receptive syringe sharing. And as hypothesized, both opioid substitution therapy, currently accessing it, and having received social support from peers, partners, and family protected against receptive syringe sharing. So women who reported these things were less likely to engage in receptive syringe sharing than women who did not. Injecting paraphernalia. So when we see incarceration coming up again, so women who were ever incarcerated, women who experienced intimate partner violence, women who inject in public places, all of them were more likely to engage in injecting paraphernalia compared to women who who had not been to prison or who had experienced intimate partner violence. Sex workers, again, about 2.5 times more likely than non-sex workers who use drugs to report injecting paraphernalia. And same goes for women whose main source of income came from an illegal source. They were about 3 times as likely as other female drug users to share injecting paraphernalia. It also appears from this work that policing practices have an important relationship with injecting paraphernalia sharing. I was bound to get that word wrong at some point. So women who reported experiencing police harassment or abuse, and those who had to bribe the police, or women who experienced police extortion, were more than twice as likely than other women to engage in these behaviors. So we can see a direct, it's not a causal relation, but we can definitely see an association between punitive policing practices and risk, injecting risk in this case. These are our 2 final models for the 2 outcomes. So the factors, this is the model that controlled for all the factors I presented. So all were included in the same model and were controlled for socio-demographic factors. And here we can see that in the final models, intimate partner violence, victimization, and injecting in public places were the 2 factors they remained. They were associated with receptive syringe sharing as well as with receptive sharing of injecting paraphernalia. And sharing paraphernalia was additionally related to sex work and police extortion. So a bit of a summary. In conclusion, we can see that factors in the physical, social, policy, and legal environment appear to play an important role in predicting unsafe injecting practices that lead to elevated HIV and hepatitis C risk among women who inject drugs. This is, as far as I know, the largest or the only quantitative study in Indonesia with women who inject drugs, and probably one of the largest in Southeast Asia in terms of sample size. So we're hopeful that it will create the basis for it will provide the evidence for changing some of these practices, for empowering NGOs to use these results and advocate for change. And this analysis does lead to a growing, it adds to a growing body of research that links social and structural factors with HIV and hepatitis C transmission among people who use drugs in general. And in the Indonesian context, the risk environment is also shaped by very high stigma against women who use drugs. Women who use drugs, from qualitative research, we know that they access services much less than men who use drugs. We know that there are also gender power relations that play into this, so it would be great to use some of the results here and do a bit more insightful work about how gender relations might shape some of these relationships. Sorry, there we go, one more. And I think to link also to Ajeng's presentation, to me what stood out most was the problematic policing practices and the fact that they were independently associated with higher injecting risk. I do feel that this research calls for a more comprehensive review of current law enforcement practices, particularly those around police and bailiff officers interacting with women, as well as potentially thinking about public injecting and safe spaces, or the lack of safe spaces for people who use drugs in Indonesia. Am I out of time now?
Oh. Just finish.
Okay. Thank you.
10 seconds to go, so well done. Thank you so much, Claudia. So now we're on to our third presenter, Lex Kuiper from the University of Amsterdam, with his presentation entitled "The Drug User as Dangerous Patient."
In this talk, I will argue that in Indonesia, drug users live in the borderland of two discourses. On the one hand, a discourse concerning the danger of drugs to the Indonesian nation has criminalized their drug use and penalized it with increasing sanctions. On the other hand, methadone clinics, needle exchange programs, and voluntary and forced rehabilitation centers have been set up in the name of treating people with a disease called addiction. This latter discourse of drug use as disease was especially prominent in the government's rhetoric prior to President Jokowi's election in late 2014. To show how these discourses intertwine, I will look at the proceedings of the 2014 International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking and at the post-independence narcotic laws. While addiction as disease is often associated with decriminalisation, I will argue that drug users in Indonesia have become dangerous patients that are expected to show a willingness to heal and to become productive again in order to receive their patient rights. In this sense, treatment and healing have become both a right and a duty. So it's also what we have seen in some of the other presentations. On June 26, 2014, while I was conducting my doctoral fieldwork among methadone users in West Java, Indonesia, the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking was celebrated at the Governor's Office. I was working with a community of methadone patients, and the representatives of this group were invited as a patient community to the commemorations that day. In the Governor's Garden, large banners displayed "Protect the future of our people and nation by fighting drugs," and "Come on, let's save our brothers and sisters." These messages of protecting and saving circulated on Facebook and at other events that day. Similar messages were brought in the public sphere at other events, like the National Narcotics Board that declared the year 2014 as the year of saving drug users, with the slogan, "It is better to rehabilitate drug users than to imprison them," while 2015 became the year that Indonesia would be free of drugs. Clearly, protecting the nation from drugs and saving drug users was imagined as a national effort. Therefore, here I will also focus mostly on the national celebration. In 2014, the commemoration took place at the Palace of the Vice President in Jakarta, and it was aired live on national television. In the presence of a high-ranking audience, the chief of the National Narcotics Board, Police Commissioner General Dr. Anang Iskandar, opened the ceremony by stating, quote, "Honorable Sir Vice President and attendants, allow me to convey here several achievements in the efforts of the National Narcotics Board to save the Indonesian people from the threat of the use and illicit trafficking of drugs," unquote. Note here how drug users are grouped together with drug traffickers in constituting a threat to the Indonesian people, a threat that has to be combated by the National Narcotics Board. This statement would be repeated several times throughout his speech. The second speaker, Vice President Widodo, similarly argued that Indonesia was heading for a disaster if the government did not intervene. He was more explicit about what threat the drug user supposedly poses to Indonesian society. He said, quote, "Throughout history we have many examples where a community, a nation, collapses because of drug abuse," unquote. To illustrate this, he compared Indonesia to Opium War China. At the end of his talk, he concluded, "From this part of history," so the Opium War in China, "perhaps we need to take a lesson. This is the challenge of our times. We face a situation that is more or less the same. We face an illegal good that can damage individuals and in the end destroys bit by bit the community and eventually the state. Like before, we have the European states, like England, that wanted to feed these Chinese opium. Now we have the international networks of narcotic dealers. It is exactly the same. They wish to feed again and again a weak nation. If we do nothing, the drug use prevalence will go up in the coming years. I have once read figures of over 5 million drug users in 2015. If we are still far from Opium War China's prevalence, thank God. For sure, if we get near to this number, it will be out of control. Everything will collapse, including our military," unquote. So, drug use is framed here simultaneously as a threat that is coming from outside of Indonesia and as something that is already spreading within. Here it is the number of drug users that gives an indication of how close Indonesia supposedly is to a collapse. And drug use is an evil that is assumed to weaken the Indonesian nation state and ultimately poses a threat to the nation's independence and existence. It is a disaster that is unfolding gradually and nearly unstoppable, while the state comes forth as a protector of the people against this disaster. The The invocation of the threat of drug consumption to society and the state is not new, but rather echoes earlier gestalts of this discourse, found in the different narcotics laws. The Dutch, who had long profited from their opium trade in the colony, started restricting drug consumption and production in the late 19th century. After independence, Suharto's New Order regime significantly increased sanctions on drug use and trafficking. The regime was perhaps triggered by the increasing availability of marijuana and heroin, but also by a conviction that with the growing unrest among the students at that time, the government had to represent a law and order by suppressing its enemies. The drug user became one such enemy, as the regime claimed in its first narcotics law of 1976. Quote, it is not impossible that drug abuse constitutes one mean among others for subversive activities, unquote. The regime encountered the drug user with suspicion and hostility, also because they were imagined to hinder the development of Indonesia. This image is found in the justification of that same law. Quote, the production, storage, distribution and use of narcotics without restrictions and strict control is a crime that greatly harms individuals and society and constitutes a big threat to humanity's survival and the existence of the state in the fields of politics, security, economy, social life, culture, as well as the developing national resilience of the Indonesian people. And national resilience here entails Indonesia's political, social and economic development and security doctrine. Subsequent laws have increased the number of offenses that demand prison sentences, created more complex differentiations among drugs, instituted minimal sentences and increased jail time. While these laws passed in 1997 and 2009 no longer equated drug use with subversive activities, the idea that the people have to be protected remained. The law still invoked the threat drugs supposedly pose to humanity's survival and national resilience. This weakening of national resilience and especially economic development was also of a central concern in the speeches of Widodo and Anang Iskandar. For the chief of the National Narcotics Board said, quote, in 2030 we plan to be an emerging economy with a stable democracy. We have a very large productive generation that is skilled in technology and should be free of drugs and drug trafficking. They are the real human capital of the future. They will advance our nation. Therefore we need to struggle together against narcotics. So far I have been talking about the threat drug use is deemed to pose to Indonesian society. While it is the international drug traffickers that are seen as weakening the nation, it is the drug user which forms the weak part of the nation and hinders its security and economic development. But at the same time, according to the Narcotics Board's annual theme, drug users could be saved. Indeed, in the same speech, the chief of the National Narcotics Board stated that drug users, quote, should be saved and guided in order to recover and to have a better future, as well as to be useful again to the nation and the state, unquote. Here, saving, guiding and recovery point at rehabilitation, which is supposed to make users end their use and make them fit for productive activities. Methadone is also granted the same ability, but to a much less degree. And thus there is some resonance with the international theme of the 2014 International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. Drug use can be prevented and rehabilitated, although the international one said treated, but in Indonesia it was rehabilitated. This theme, the chief of the National Narcotic Board's comments, contains, quote, the hope that society will not have a wrong view of narcotic users. People who are sick need our help to stop. They need rehabilitation so they can function as normal people in society, in order for them to have a healthy life. Towards dealers, we will remain aggressive for supply reduction. We need to show society that drug users are victims. They are sick. There are two dimensions, the criminal and the victim. Here, the idea of drug use as a disease comes to the fore, and it is suggested that by treating the drug user's disease, they can return to their productive selves and be useful again. Like the notion that drug users are a threat, the idea that drug users suffer from a disease is not new. A quick glance at the narcotics laws shows that rehabilitation for treatment of drug users has been incorporated since 1976 and has gained prominence in later laws. But on closer inspection, it's clear that this has had little impact. All laws have left the possibility for imprisonment open, and this has been used zealously, causing the current prison overpopulation. Since 2009, however, there has been a proliferation of statements that drug users are victims and patients, seemingly indicating a growing acceptance that addiction has to be understood as a disease. For instance, the Indonesian Supreme Court acknowledged that A large part of the criminals and convicts on drug charges are part of a drug user or even victim category. Those who, if seen from a medical viewpoint, are in fact people suffering from a disease. Because of this, imprisonment of those involved is not the right measure, as it ignores the importance of care and treatment." Unquote. Likewise, a joint statement from the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, several ministries, the National Police and the National Narcotics Board expressed their commitment to reduce the number of drug addicts and victims of drug abuse through a program of treatment, care and recovery of suspects, those on trial and convicts. And you can also see it in these kind of messages that were spread by the Narcotics Board that people shouldn't be rehabilitated and not in prison. So if we take these statements at face value, it would seem that drug users figure in judicial texts and in these speeches as victims of the criminal drug trafficker. But the separation is not that neat. Drug users inhabit a borderland, a vague area between suffering a disease and constituting a danger. While more and more of this borderland was now labeled as the zone of the patient in government rhetoric, drug users were still mistrusted or are still mistrusted when they are not trying to heal. In his speech, Alang Iskander said that drug users have to seek healing through force by a judge, or voluntarily, quote-unquote voluntarily, by reporting oneself as drug user. As another officer of the National Narcotics Board once told me, quote, "If you have injured your leg, you will search for treatment, so you can walk again. With drugs, you do not realize you are sick. That is why you need to report." Unquote. The officer reasons that drug use impairs the will to heal. That is why drug users need to report. To report is to really become a patient and not a criminal. And you can also see that in this meme that was spread by the National Narcotics Board from Kadiri, in which they also said that if you report your family member, they will not be sent to jail but rehabilitated. Reporting drug users has been obligatory since 1976, and since 1997, neglecting to report is an offense with severe punishment. Also for the user's family members, as Ajeng already told. And to my best knowledge, this has never been used, but maybe you know if people will get arrested, but in West Java I haven't heard it. But it was only after the institutions for compulsory registration, or Institutie Penerima Wajib Lapor, IPWL, were appointed in 2011 that actual registration began at health centers. The aim of IPWL is to make drug users or their families report the drug user to a nearby health center to start their treatment in order to, according to the 2009 narcotics law, quote, "fulfill the rights of drug users in obtaining treatment and or care through medical and social rehabilitation," unquote. By registering, drug users obtain certain rights such as access to free rehabilitation and treatment. Moreover, it provides a way to escape a trial for drug use when arrested by the police. The registration card of the IPWL is supposed to sanction up to 2 of such escapes by allowing the continuation of treatment. The third will result in a trial, although the law is not very clear on this. At every event for drug users hosted by the National Narcotics Board that I attended, users were urged to report themselves, because as patients they would get their legal protection and treatment. While judges never ordered rehabilitation in West Java, or at least not in my research location, the police would in rare cases arrange drug users to receive rehabilitation without their case ever reaching the court, if they had close ties to an NGO that was also an IPWL. More commonly, however, the patient status was used, at least by my informants, in bargaining with the police over bribes. And unsurprisingly, most users were hesitant to register, fearing that the data would end up in the hands of the police, and preferred to remain dangerous patients. So, drug users thus hold an ambiguous position as both victim and weak elements in the nation. On the one hand, the drug user is seen as unprotective and weakening the national resilience. His demand for drugs is assumed to threaten the nation's independence and development. On the other hand, the drug user figures as a victim of drug use himself. As I have argued in this talk, it is in this borderland that drug users live. They figure as threats, as diseased, or more often as both. While they are now increasingly labeled as patients, they remain dangerous. By actively embracing the subject position of the patient by requesting treatment, some of the threat they are deemed to pose is mitigated. While treatment is now a right, the duty to seek treatment comes before the right to receive it. And if we consider the recent developments in Indonesia, where the new chief of the National Narcotics Board has called for abolishing rehabilitation, as he claims that the distinction between dealer and user is just offers an opportunity for people to hide behind the user label, it is clear how easily a dangerous patient subject, even when they have registered, can slip back into a threat to be combated. Thank you.
I'll just talk from here, doesn't really matter all that much. We're on to our fourth and final presenter. That's Elizabeth Kramer from the University of Sydney, with a presentation titled Is Anybody Listening? Illegal Drugs Policy and Academic Activism in Indonesia.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out for this last session today. And I'm just going to apologise in advance because I'm extraordinarily jet lagged. So if I muddle my words a little bit, I'm very sorry. You can pick me up on that as I go along. Okay, so in February 2015, Indonesian President Joko Widodo opened the 2015 National Coordination Meeting on Drugs by promising a new, renewed commitment to fighting the ongoing war. Widodo claimed that each day 50 people in Indonesia die from illegal drug use, and that leads to 18,000 deaths per year. During his speech, he also reiterated that the execution of several convicted drug traffickers, including foreign nationals, was necessary and important to discourage the trafficking of drugs into the country. Jokowi's declaration that drugs presented an emergency to Indonesia, not least the country's vulnerable and impressionable youth, fits very neatly with pre-existing discourses on illegal narcotic use in Indonesia. Government campaigns and public service announcements have long warned about the evils of drug use in Indonesia, linking their usage to broader immoralities such as sexual promiscuity or sex bebas, dropping out of school, and an increase in HIV/AIDS rates. So posters like the one that you see there are very common throughout Indonesia. The government portrays drug users and traffickers as evil and morally deficient, but also patients, as Lex has just explained. But that punishment is a necessary part of keeping the rest of society safe. And it's only in recent years that the idea of rehabilitation has gained prominence, but there are still a lot of issues as have already been discussed. So my talk today takes a little bit of a different tack to some of the previous presenters. And I'm going to be looking at how academics fit into the world of government policy making, particularly around drug issues in Indonesia. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this topic is because I'm quite a new scholar. I've only recently finished my PhD, and I've been grappling with the question of how useful my research needs to be. How much should I be tailoring my research to policymakers and people in government? So this topic is something that's been really interesting to me, and Claudia and I talked a lot about it while we were in Indonesia, and I thought this would be a really interesting case study given what happened last year. So this paper, borrowing from Hale, 2008, defines academic activists as those working within academic institutions who also strive to put issues on the policy agenda and encourage public debate to drive social and political change. Traditionally, academia and activism are seen as two separate worlds, governed by different rules. So at a very basic level, this debate harks back to a fundamental tension in academia, where on the one hand you have the search for an objective knowledge, on the other hand you have the idea that all knowledge comes from a political context. The pressure to be objective is seen to clash with the underlying motives for activism. So activism is seen as being emotional and subjective and partisan, whereas academia and academics should be detached, objective, and impartial in their work. More commonly, epistemological issues such as separating theory and practice, observation and action, and the universal and the particular discourage academics from getting too involved in activism. even in institutions where academic activism is somewhat supported, it can feel as if certain knowledges are privileged and those pertaining to academic activism are somewhere down the bottom of that hierarchy. Furthermore, academics that do engage frequently in activism are not professionally rewarded for their efforts, as universities tend to focus more on publication outputs or teaching records in their markers of an academic's value. So at least that is the debate in many countries, including Australia, where I come from. But I would argue that the role of academics as activists in Indonesia is actually much less contested, especially in the social sciences. So there's less of a focus on publishing, but more of a focus on working with NGOs, teaching, and sort of trying to influence government policy in useful ways. For a lot of the academics that I talk to, the role of social justice in their work is at the forefront, and their connection to activism is quite unambiguous. They don't see the tension that we have these debates about in other places. Academics are more likely to publish op-eds, they're more likely to write in newspapers, appear on television, be involved in consultancy work, start their own NGOs or be linked to NGOs. And these activities are seen as integral parts of being an academic in Indonesia, unlike in other traditional academic spaces where they are seen more like add-ons. So the Indonesian situation is quite an interesting case study for how academics engage with government and try to influence policy. So instead of grappling with the issue of how much they should be caring or how useful their work should be, they just do it. And my research looks particularly at the challenges that they face in trying to influence policy. So I developed 4 main research questions, and I won't read them out, but they're up there. And I adopted a qualitative methodology, which I won't go through too much, but it was a series of semi-structured interviews with a number of respondents, and you'll understand how they were chosen as we go through the rest of the presentation. So, who was involved in trying to lobby to change illegal drug policy in Indonesia? So, in 2015, there was a small informal coalition of academics across a range of different fields that came together, concerned by the government's approach to the so-called drug emergency. These academics came from 2 discernible camps. So, firstly, there were the academics who had been involved with drug-related issues for a very long time, either through research or their outreach programs. And many of these academics were also involved in HIV/AIDS awareness campaigns, or were part of informal networks that sometimes collaborated on projects aimed at supporting injecting drug users and drug users with HIV/AIDS. Many of the academics from this camp also had a personal connection to drug issues, whether that be a member of their family who had had issues of addiction or something along those lines. The second group of academics did not have a history of being involved in issues related to drugs, but were primarily motivated by human rights concerns. So they were particularly driven by their rejection of the death penalty and became interested in government policies related to drugs, mostly because of the death penalty issues that became very prominent last year in Indonesia. So looking at the second research question that I had about how academics were attempting to influence policy, there's a kind of standard approach for academics who want to try and influence government policy, and so the 3 sort of points that I outline here are not necessarily exclusive to this particular group. The first one is meeting with policymakers. In the specific instance of trying to shape drug policy, there are only a few academics that actually had direct access to BNN or the Presidential Cabinet Office, and after initial discussions, this path seemed very firmly closed off to them. The main reason cited for this was that the government simply wasn't interested in reassessing their approach to drug policy, and that the approach that they had been taking up till then had been interpreted quite favourably by the public, so they didn't really see any need to adapt it or change it at all. The second in the process is to try and gain publicity for their cause. So A lot of Indonesian academics, as I mentioned before, write op-eds that are published in national newspapers or local newspapers. That's a very popular way of getting a message out. But even in this particular instance, it was an issue that the media weren't very interested in publishing on. And this is sort of a similar rationale to the government not really wanting to engage with academics because it seemed like the public was so supportive of the death penalty, the media also weren't interested in providing space for debate on this. They just didn't see it as being something that was very important. So thirdly, and sort of where this case gets a little bit different from some other realms, academics were talking to colleagues and trying to find alliances. So this is when discussions amongst an informal network began with the aim of creating a coalition of supporters. And this is where many of the more human rights-oriented academics came into the fold. So the rallying of support from others, particularly academics, was then used for the next step of the group's efforts to challenge the government in reassessing their policy. So capitalising on informal networks that had been built, academic activists tried a new approach, publishing a critique of the government in an international scientific journal. With the looming execution of a number of convicted drug smugglers in June 2015, a small group of academics and civil society leaders banded together to sign an open letter to the Indonesian government questioning the validity of the government's national statistics on drug use and drug-related mortality. The publication of this article in The Lancet was a manifestation of critiques against the government that had been going on for some time prior to the release of this particular letter. Academics in Indonesia, particularly in the psychology and public health spaces, had long had concerns about the government's collection of data related to drug use and addiction, as well as the rate of drug-related deaths. The article challenged the data that the government was using to justify its drug policies, claiming that the methodology that they had used to collect that data was flawed and had created a tendency to overestimate figures. There was also issues around the definitions of drug use and drug dependence that were used in the study, and a general lack of transparency and explanation about how that data was collected in the first place. While the letter was deliberately framed as an academic exercise, the underlying hope of the letter was actually that the government would reconsider their death penalty, and particularly the impending executions of the convicted drug smugglers that was coming up. But it was also a general critique of the government's sort of data and the way that it had been used to shape the drug emergency and to sort of promote it as emergency when maybe there were some other more nuanced things going on there. One of the main motivations for signing the letter, raised by many of the non-drug related academics, was that the previous actions that they had been attempting, like the publishing of op-eds and talking to people in government, hadn't worked. And there was also an overall acknowledgement that human rights arguments against the death penalty were not effective, and that trying a new approach, which involved a scientific argument against the drug policy, was a new way to convey critiques of the government's policy itself. So in a way, they were hoping to convince the government with science rather than appealing to them with human rights arguments. So, what did the letter in The Lancet achieve? It would be very easy to say that it didn't achieve anything. There was no public response from the government on the article. There was some media coverage, particularly in English language media in Indonesia and internationally, but the executions went ahead, and so I guess the main purpose of the letter was not met. However, while there was no public response from the government, key academics who were involved in the Lancet article were confident that it had been read by people in BNN and in the presidential cabinet. This wasn't necessarily the good thing. Some of the academics expressed concerns later that the letter had been offensive, particularly to BNN officials, even though they had been very careful in the drafting of the letter and had tried very hard for the language to remain rational and neutral. In terms of post-Lancet relations, things have definitely deteriorated. There are a few reasons for this, but one of the main reasons that was cited is that the new head of the BNN, who succeeded after Anang Iskandar, is reportedly not very interested in talking to academics at all, whereas Anang had apparently had a fairly good relationship with quite a few prominent academics in the field. And there was some speculation that the critique published in the Lancet had a negative impact on this transition. Ultimately, and to the deep disappointment of many of the signatories, the executions of the drug smugglers went ahead. And actually, in the follow-up interviews that I did in February this year, there was a lot of pessimism towards any hope of policy reform in Indonesia on drugs at this point in time, particularly in the harm reduction direction that these particular academics were hoping for. Oh. Should I restart now? Okay, so the analysis for this particular data set is quite new, but I'll just end the presentation by highlighting some of the main points that have come out already. So firstly, and possibly quite understandable, is the complete disinterest of the government in engaging in any kind of discussion around improving the illegal drugs policy in Indonesia at the moment, especially from the BNN and the presidential cabinet level. And as I mentioned, there are a couple of reasons for this. We can talk about it in the discussion. I'm sure the other people on the panel have a lot of insight on that as well. But I think that the fact that they're so disinterested in talking to academics on this actually betrays this as being a very politically significant issue. The government believes that the majority of the public support them in the death penalty, and that it would be detrimental to them to change their approach at this point in time. So actually, the whole debate around drugs and what direction to go in is a really good one to have, because the government is using this public support as their argument, and if the public perceptions can be changed, then perhaps the government approach can also be changed. Secondly, human rights arguments were not effective. Campaigning on ideals put forward by the Convention of Human Rights, religion, or any other platform that rejects the death penalty were not effective, and many of the people who were involved in campaigns using those discourses acknowledge that. The fact that an open letter in a scientific medical journal could attract signatories from a range of academic realms, NGOs, and that these signatories openly admit that other attempts were having no effect, reflects a conscious shift for many activists to embracing scientific arguments against policy rather than human rights arguments. Thirdly, another interesting outcome of the interviews was actually talking to the academics about the consequences of signing the open letter. So obviously it was an open letter, so their names were published and everybody knew who they were. No one expressed any kind of concerns about their personal safety in signing that letter. No one was worried about consequences for them or their careers. But what they did worry about was annoying the government. So annoying the government seemed to be the key hesitation in signing the letter. And I think that's because academic activists understand that the power imbalance between them and policymakers is quite stark. And the approach, particularly in this case, and maybe you could generalize this further to Indonesia, is that they have more of a softly coercive approach rather than going out there and trying to bludgeon the government and shame them into making different decisions. Also, personal relations are seen as being very crucial in influencing policy, and a lot of thought and effort went into wording the Lancet letter as it was worded, with the express hope that it wouldn't offend anyone, even though it would. But they tried really hard not to have that happen. Fourthly, So I guess tangentially related to that last point is that academic activists acknowledge that the democratic sphere has opened up a lot, and there are a lot of opportunities for them to say and do things that weren't possible in the past. But many still note that they have to proceed with caution, not because they're worried about consequences to them personally, but because they're worried about the causes that they represent. So coming back to the previous point, personal relations are very important, and they don't want to taint these, particularly with government representatives. So I think we can also say that although people aren't worried about consequences to themselves, there is still a degree of self-censorship that goes on. And this is also a big contrast between academic activists and sort of NGO activists who are often quite happy to protest on the street and have demos and things like that. Academics are a lot more careful about where they place their critiques and how they frame them.